And you'll notice that a lot of these lines are closing up, and I'm going to be going in not only with a little bit of whiteout at a critical stage, but the reason I'm using this slick paper is we're also going to go in with a razor blade, and I'm going to show you a few tricks. Say again? Thank you. Thanks. Yes, give me a shout if I start going off the board here. What was I saying? Yes, I will be using the razor blade shortly because I'll be chiseling back some of these lines. Okay. And I've got to be careful at this stage not to smear the ink with the lines I've already drawn. And again, scale patterns, fur patterns, any texture you're creating, be it on an animal in this case, or clothing, if we were doing a drawing of a person from any era, any sort of rendering you do of texture becomes a gray pattern, and you want to think about that as a gray pattern. I'm doing rendering here on the bottom edge of the leg and leaving an area underneath unrendered so that it looks like reflected light coming up off the ground. There's a lot of reflected light in nature, and we tend not to think about it, but it's part of what makes things look like they have weight, volume, and look alive. All right, now this is this guy's knee, the one that's on the ground.
Steve?
Yes?
How carefully do you plan out light source when you're doing that?
It's not so much, well, okay, in some cases, Morgan, I'll plan out a light source carefully, particularly if I'm doing a drawing that is supposed to have a lot of atmosphere or a strong emotional content, because light plays such a role in conveying emotion and atmosphere. This is a drawing more concerned with movement, so I'm not that concerned with light source per se, other than making sure that it'll frustrate some of the people that are watching this demo, that I'm going to work this to a certain point, and then I'm going to lay in some really heavy blacks on this lower dinosaur because I need to indicate the shadow of the dinosaur that's standing over it. But I've already got that in my head. So in this case, I'm working with a fairly generic light source. You know, the sun's up here. But there is reflected light. I mean, if you've ever been, particularly in the winter, you know, there's a lot of reflected light coming off the snow and ice. But spring, summer, I mean, you know, vegetation, grass, sand, gravel, I mean, any ground surface has a certain amount of reflected light coming off of it. And it just helps to convey a little bit of the volume and the shape if you think about sometimes using the possibility of a reflected light source so that you're rendering your shadows along the edge of the cylinder that's the body of this creature rather than just along the bottom. Okay? That makes sense?
Oh, yeah.
Some of what I say may not. I'll try to warn you when that's the case. Okay, I'm reaching a point now with this drawing where I'm going to go in with some strong black again, but I first need to do a little more work on these. Again, this is one of my morning warm-up drawings, so there's the toes here are a little spazzier than I would like. Good rule of thumb for young dinosaur drawers out there: dinosaurs have feet much like chickens or crows or turkeys. And it's okay to think about them in that way because that's part of how you'll be able to catch the scale patterns on the toes and so on. In fact, those of us who live in and around Vermont, I love it when I see groups of wild turkeys moving through the woods, because that's probably as close as we're going to get to our lifetime in seeing what groups of dinosaurs wandering around look like. I mean, especially when you see large tom turkeys moving around. Okay, I got to give this a little bit of time to dry before I go to the next stage. So what I'll do now is work on the vegetation a little bit. I talked earlier about fern patterns. Let's get into that. And I'll start down here. Ferns and those kind of plants tend to work with a leaf pattern where you've got a central stalk, if you will, and the broader parts of the leaf come off of there. Now I'm just sketching these. I would be paying more attention to these forms if I were doing a finer drawing or if I was working with an actual fern as a model, but I'm just sort of want to indicate here basic fern shapes. And right now I'm doing these with a pen so that you can see how I'm approaching it, and then I'm going to do some with a brush. And it's important to get a variety. Nature is not symmetrical by nature. That's redundant. And you want to get that sense of a little bit of the chaos that's in the woods and in the woodlands. And so, you know, you're never going to see a perfect fern. There's always going to be breaks. There's always going to be breeze moving it around or whatever. And I try to get that kind of movement into my drawings that involve vegetation. Okay, and I also find it effective sometimes to just indicate fern shapes. Once you've drawn a couple of stronger fern shapes, you can go in and do things like this that just sort of indicate to the reader's eye there's another, you know, there's more fern patterns down there. But you can be really sketchy about it and let it just be suggestive rather than super specific. All right, now on the other end of the drawing, I'm going to go in and do the same sort of thing, but I'm going to work this time with a brush and show you how I approach it with a brush. And this time I'll use one of my dip brushes as opposed to the, this is a number 4 watercolor. I'm experimenting with a synthetic sable. I used to work just with actual sable, but they're expensive. They've gotten really expensive, and the quality of the synthetic sable has gotten a lot better. Okay, so I'm going to do some fern patterns here. These are going to be larger ferns, and again, I'm going to lay down a little bit of a pattern. Here's my central leaves. Wow, this is really crappy ink. Notice how I watch my language on the air. And it's okay, again, as long as you're laying in a basic pattern and sticking to it.
What kind of ink do you usually use?
I've got a really ancient jar of Higgins Black Magic ink, which had a great formula in the 70s and early 80s, and at some point they changed the formula of the ink, and now it just grays out. It doesn't have the oomph that the old Black Magic. So I'm experimenting with different kinds. This is the eternal permanent black ink, and as you can see, it tends to gray out. I don't know how clearly that's coming through, but I'm not getting a true black out of it, and that's frustrating. When I'm working with particularly brushing ink, I really want some black lines. I don't want them to gray out. I don't want them to break up. Now, part of the fun of doing these kind of vegetative patterns is you can really play. I mean, you're not going to find a portion of the woods or woodland area that has just one species of fern or one type of plant. You'll see pockets of growth and so on. So don't be afraid when you're doing drawings that involve woodland or natural settings to really play with the patterns. I'm going to play a little bit under here. And I'm also going to play a little bit down this side. Now what I'm doing with the brush is I'm sort of indicating the shadow areas so that I'm